It used to be, for example, attendance issues was one of the big things about whether or not somebody was going to be disciplined or whether somebody was performing satisfactorily. Well, that's maybe not the way to measure performance anymore. So how do you measure if you can't actually see what that person's doing? How do you measure their productivity? So I think managers have to rethink, or some managers have to rethink, how do we measure that somebody is providing the results that we are looking for? It's not just the amount of time they're working on something. What are the results that we're seeing?
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, and this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. According to Pew Research, in the fall of 2020, arguably the height of the pandemic, over 70% of workers whose jobs could be performed from home were doing so. Today, over 50% of those workers are still working remote all or most of the time, according to Pew. So now, 2.5 years after the pandemic started, some of those workers' employers are trying to coax their employees back into their offices on a full or part-time basis. Other employers have embraced remote work on a full or part-time basis, and a recent Gallup study shows that engagement is highest among fully remote workers and lowest for fully on-site workers who could perform at least a portion of their job from home. According to a SHRM poll, almost half of surveyed workers say that they will look for a remote position in their next job, and almost a quarter say that remote work is a must for their next position. That SHRM poll said that 63% of their respondents said that being required to work from an office makes no sense when work can be completed remotely. But at the same time, Pew Research says 65% of employees in remote work environments feel less connected to their coworkers than they did before the pandemic, and 30% of those workers admit to experiencing motivation challenges. Add to all of this the intense competition for talent that many employers face, and it is easy to understand why many businesses are still rethinking their policies and practices around remote work. Joining me today to discuss all of this is Mary Ann Fulgium. Mary Ann is a senior HR consultant with the Whitney Smith Company, where she consults with employers of all sizes and from a variety of industries. Prior to joining Whitney Smith over 15 years ago, she held HR roles in both the public and private sector. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Mary Ann.
Thank you, Mike. I'm happy to be here.
So like me, you have clients in a bunch of different kinds of businesses. So I just rattled off a bunch of statistics, but beyond that, what are you seeing in the wild with your clients and remote work?
Well, it was very interesting as I was hearing those statistics because I'm hearing all of that with the clients that we have. It really depends on the type of industry the employer is in, what the jobs are that the workers are doing. Some of our clients really are trying to get their employees back to work, and they're feeling the pushback from the employees. They're feeling that their employees are saying, hey, we've been able to work remotely this long. Why can't we continue to do so? But then also there's that loss of camaraderie, some of that informal conversation that happens just, when you walk down to somebody's office or, sitting around in the break room or something like that. You lose some of that when you're working remotely 100% of the time. So it really depends on what the jobs are, what the industry type is, what the work is. We're hearing it all.
Yeah, that's I think that's the hardest thing to measure is what is that collaboration worth. I went out on my own. I left corporate America 24 years ago, and it was the one thing I've missed is that ability just to walk down the hall, knock on somebody's door, and say, "Hey, can I just bounce something off?" and not have that constant, that's that, you know, impromptu conversation about something. Now I've built, and I think a lot of remote workers are learning to do it too, but I've built a network around myself that I can do that. I've got the Entrepreneurs Organization, which is, local business owners, who I have a lot of events with, and I can pick up the phone, I can call. I've got, HR friends and consultants who I know who I can always call. But I think for a lot of employees who haven't already built those networks, that collaboration issue, it leads to some of that loneliness people have mentioned, that disconnection from their peers. And have you seen any employers come up with ways to facilitate those connections while they're still working remote or partially remote?
Well, actually, the most common thing that I see is that more of a hybrid type of model where they can work remotely, the employees can work remotely, maybe 2 days a week, and then come back into the office 2 or 3 days a week. That way, they've got that those informal discussions, where they're working together. Also, if you even think about new employees that start with an organization, they don't have the benefit of some of those little things that have become company culture that employees that have been there for a while have. So they might be even more feeling less connected to the organization. So I think that hybrid model seems to be the most common type of model that I'm seeing for employers that can do that.
Do you see those employers putting people on schedules, or just, so where you work in the office Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and you can work remote Thursday and Friday? Or do you see them staggering that, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or something like that? Or are they just saying you come in a couple days a week when it's convenient for you?
Yeah, it really depends on what the specific jobs are that individuals are doing. So teams that need to collaborate together, they might have a specific time that they need to be there so that they are working together. Probably that's the more common, is to have set days that people are there, because otherwise you're not really getting what you're looking for, which is, hey, let's work together to talk about what's going on and that type of thing. So,
And do you see that mostly being decided by that team leader, that frontline manager who's working with that team saying that, or is the company saying everybody's going to be here on these days company wide?
I really see it coming. The ones I've dealt with are coming from the top.
So if we've got 150 employees in our offices, we're going to see all 150 on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or whatever days they decide.
I'm starting to see more and more of that too. Maybe the economic change is making a difference, but I'm seeing more and more employers saying now, we want to get people back in. We understand that you can do some remote work, but we want to get people back in. The other thing that I've noticed is the employers that are working more remotely are having more, I think they call it hot desking, where they don't have a specific space that is their own. They have a common area that their employees can use for when they do come in, they can use the phone, the equipment, or whatever, but they don't have a space that's their own. So that's what I'm seeing with the employers that are more remotely. Maybe the employees just come in once a week or something like that.
And I know, a lot of employers are looking at the increasing employee costs and all of that, and wondering, okay, do we really need this much office space if
Mhm,
we've only
mhm.
got on any given day a third or half of our staff on site? And so hot desking or something like that makes a lot of sense if I can, especially with employee costs going up, and the real estate is, largely an employee cost. It's not on the same line item in the P&L, but we have all this real estate because we need a place, to put butts and seats, right? So if we
Right.
only need half of those, maybe, and so that may be one of the factors employers want to consider too is, okay, employees are costing me a lot more. A lot of them want to work hybrid
Mhm,
or fully
mhm.
remote, and maybe I can, offset some of that cost with with lower real estate cost.
Yes. And the other thing that I'm hearing, we've got a couple of recruiters in our office, and they, as they are talking with potential employees, applicants, they're hearing the question of, can I work remotely very often now? So that's becoming one of the conditions that employees are wanting to come back to work or to work for an organization is, do they have the option to be flexible or to be able to work remotely at least a couple days a week?
It's interesting how many HR roles, HR professionals I see posting in different talk, chat forums for HR folks, saying, "Hey, I'm looking for an HR generalist role, fully remote." And I'm thinking that's a hard one. If you've got a fully remote organization, maybe that makes sense, and so Secret Imperative closed or went remote in March of 2020. And heck, I own the office building and I sold it this year because we're just not going back. It's worked wonderful for us. But and maybe if I and my wife, who runs the HR side of things here, weren't HR professionals, and we had to go hire somebody, I'd have to hire a remote HR person. It'd be a remote person. So it's a it's an interesting thing. Now, when we're talking about remote and having people full time or hybrid, do you see any concerns with somebody's status as to whether they're exempt or non exempt that employers should really think about when they're deciding whether somebody can work remote or not?
Well, one of the important rules about non-exempt employees is that you have to be able to track your time and be paid time and a half for hours worked over 40. And so an employer who allows a non-exempt employee to work remotely needs to make sure they have a really good tracking system in place so that they are getting an accurate accounting of the hours worked and are paying them appropriately.
And that's, everybody says they want remote work because of the flexibility it gives them. But when I'm paying you hourly, I've got accountability to the federal government to make sure that we're capturing that correctly. And I think a lot of employees who are non-exempt don't understand. Yeah, you may not get to work whenever you want to, like an exempt employee will, because I need to be able to track when you're working. And also, often those non-exempt employees are supporting other teams, and you've got to be on the clock. I mean, somebody needs to be able to pick up and call HR at 9 a.m. or IT or whoever, those support functions. You need somebody who's going to pick up the phone.
Yeah, and so the other, I mean, that's a very important point. Is if your job is to be support to other employees, and obviously you have to be available for that. Another point that I think a lot of employers don't realize is that just they might say, "I'm going to just pay this person a salary, then that way we don't have to worry about it." But just because somebody's paid salary doesn't mean that they're necessarily exempt. And so, the employer needs to make sure that they have that job classified appropriately, because you can have a salaried non-exempt individual, so you still have to keep track of their hours worked and still pay them, overtime if they go over 40 in the work week.
Yeah, I don't see a ton of people doing salary non-exempt, but I've run across it, and usually when I run across it, it's because they did it wrong, and they're
Mhm.
looking for somebody to help them dig out of the situation. I'm their first call, and all I do is hand it off to a comp person because if it's got numbers involved, I want to run away from it.
Well, I think there's a misconception that if you're salaried, you're automatically exempt. And that's so employers might say, well, we'll just give you a salary. And they think it's okay. Like that's the solution, So just make sure they're classified properly.
And like I said, we're fully remote, and I've got 22 employees I think right now, and they I've got a lot of young parents, and they've got kids or people with dogs, and the dog just ate the couch, and they get to deal with things. And I give in almost all my with just a few exceptions, almost all my employees are non-exempt, and but we give them the flexibility. I mean, you can still give flexibility, and I didn't want to suggest that you couldn't, but they need to clock in and out. We just need them to and we've got a system. We use QuickBooks Payroll, and we use their time clock function, and people can just clock in and out. And we can also see. We use Zoom for our chat and our communication, so we can see people can say I'm away, or or do not disturb or whatever, so we can see what their status is, and people will update. I'm feeding Carson, and put a note there, and so that's what they're doing. And because we've got good measures of quality and productivity, I don't have to sweat it. I mean, I don't have to overmanage. And I think that's one of the predictions I had when everybody went remote in March, was that the companies who had good management, who had processes in place to manage, to look at production and to monitor and measure productivity and quality and whatever the other key indicators were for their workforce, they weren't going to have a problem in remote. They could apply that framework to a remote. But those employers who manage by walking around, what are you working on? What are you doing today? What's your day? And just constantly looking over their employees' shoulders to oh, look busy, here comes the boss. That kind of atmosphere. They're the ones who I thought would suffer, and anecdotally, at least in the conversations I've had, those are the ones who really struggled.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Mike. That's one of the things that I've noticed as well, is that employers really need to have a clear indication of how they're going to measure productivity. As you were saying, it used to be, for example, attendance issues was one of the big things about whether or not somebody was going to be disciplined, or whether somebody was performing satisfactorily. Well, that's maybe not the way to measure performance anymore. So how do you measure if you can't actually see what that person's doing? How do you measure their productivity? So I think managers have to rethink, or some managers have to rethink, how do we measure that somebody is providing the results that we are looking for? It's not just the amount of time they're working on something. What are the results that we're seeing? You also mentioned like daycare and pets and that type of thing. An organization, an employer really needs to think about, with the job that individual is doing, are they in a position that they really can be flexible on time, working remotely, or do they have to be available from this time to this time? Does that mean that the employee still needs to worry about daycare, or still needs to worry about being in a place where they're not going to be interrupted? So really the type of work that employee is doing, and the type of culture that employer is going to determine some of those answers, but it's something to look at.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. For years, I've argued that most employers are second chance employers. Whether they know it or not, they likely have some employees whose critical errors in judgment have led to involvement with the criminal justice system. And most leaders want to be fair in their evaluation of candidates' criminal history information. But they aren't sure how best to do so and still protect their organization from liability, loss, or litigation. And that is why I have a pre-recorded webinar entitled The Business Case for Becoming a Second Chance Employer on our website at imperativeinfo.com. I dive into the statistics and studies surrounding criminal offenses, recidivism, and employment as we review the benefits to businesses from considering and hiring qualified former offenders for positions. And this webinar is approved for an hour of recertification credit from both HRCI and SHRM. You can watch this and all of my other webinars on demand at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 64 and enter the keyword remote. That's REMOTE. And now back to my conversation with Mary Ann Fulgium. Another thing I think a lot of employers were surprised by when they started calling employees back as early as, late 2020, early 2021 is all of a sudden they've got, we're a Fort Worth based company, and all of a sudden I've got an employee in Richardson, which is, if you don't live in North Texas, that's an hour and a half ride with traffic. Or I've got an employee in Colorado. What the heck? I didn't, and they're having to figure that out. What kind of geographic locations are you restrictions or requirements are you seeing employers place on remote or hybrid employees?
I'm not really seeing a lot of geographic restrictions per se. It's really more about whether or not the employee is going to be required to come back into the office and how many days a week is that going to happen. So if they move to Richardson and they can come to Fort Worth still 1 or 2 days a week, then that's not a problem. But something to think about as well is if an employee moves out of state, then you start having to worry about whether or not that state has any kind of maybe tax issues or employment law issues that you need to be concerned about. And so even with FMLA, for example, if you have an employee that's working in another state, you might think, and let's say you're an FMLA covered employer, you might think that employee isn't eligible for FMLA just because they're working by themselves remotely. But the reality is the DOL looks at where the employee gets the work site from which the employee gets their work, right? So if we're in Fort Worth at a place that has 50 or more employees, but we're working with an employee who lives in Colorado, that employee is still going to be eligible for FMLA because you don't count that employee's residence as their work site,
Wow.
So there's some of those little complex kind of issues that come up that you don't think about until you have to deal with it.
Yeah, and do you really want to? I mean, that's what smaller employers like me, with a couple dozen employees, we have to consider. Do we really want to become a multi-state employer? Do I want to register my business in this other state? Subscribe to workers' comp in that state? Mm-hmm. Do I want to, pay taxes? There's tax withholding issues in some states. Texas, pew pew, we don't have a state income tax, but a lot of places do, and they expect us to, employers to withhold and do filings and all of that. There's some states that may not be a problem, but if I have an employee who wants to move to Colorado, or not Colorado, but California,
yeah.
Suddenly it's like, or New York. Suddenly I'm really going to reconsider that, and so I think employers really have to pay attention to what those and make it clear to the employees. It's I lost an employee. Her husband got a new job and moved to Oklahoma, and she was a great employee, but I didn't want to become an Oklahoma employer for one employee, right? And go to that burden of what the cost was. And so, our rule we've told our employees they can live anywhere in Texas, but they have to be able to be here for a meeting with 48 hours notice in Fort Worth on their own dime. And that's the thing. And I don't anticipate ever needing to do that necessarily because remote has worked so well for us. Mm-hmm. But I was really clear up front with the employees about what the circumstances were and what the boundaries were. And so far, the furthest employee right now, I think, is Wichita Falls, which is, it's a good little drive. Yeah. And I've had one employee consider moving to Austin. So, and I'm always up for just holding our employee retreats down in Austin. That's a better place than, it's fresh.
Well, Mike, if I can touch on that as well, the thing that you did there that I would encourage any employer to do is you were really clear up front about what the rules were. And I think what happens sometimes when it gets kind of, I'm going to use the word mushy, but, when you get these complaints and stuff, it's because nobody's really clearly thought about the rules. So you were really clear that, hey, we only want to do work in Texas. You're going to have to be here for a meeting, whatever, once a month or whatever, but you were very clear. And so the employees know what to expect and they can make that decision of whether they want to do it or not. Where I run into problems or where I see problems is, where an employee's been allowed to do something and then all of a sudden they can't do it anymore. And then they start feeling like it's about them or against them. And so having clear job descriptions, that really helps the employee to know why their job needs to be at the work site, if that's where it needs to be, or what parts of their job can be done remotely. Just the rules of engagement. So the fact that you were so clear with that, I think, is great.
Are you seeing that? I mean, we certainly changed our job descriptions. Are you seeing a lot of employers changing their job descriptions to describe in the job description what the expectations around in-person attendance versus remote work are?
I'm not seeing a lot of job descriptions change, but I am seeing a lot of employers doing a better job at doing job descriptions.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's clear what your job actually is. And so it's not the
Mm-hmm.
job description we wrote in 2013 and it's sat
Right,
on the shelf since then. Okay.
right, right.
So just, so they're at least trying to communicate better to employees about we're all on the same page here about what the job is.
Yeah. And if I can make one more point, so part of what we do, we're a licensed private investigation firm, and there's several of us here that are licensed private investigators. And I'm going to say in this last year, 2022, I personally have probably done more investigations than I have um, in this less than a year than almost the whole 15 years I've been here. I mean, it's been crazy what the complaints have been. It's, they're not necessarily true, like discrimination complaints, but the employee feeling like they're being treated unfairly. And it's either because they've come back to the workplace and said, I'm not going to put up with that anymore, or they've been allowed to do something and now they don't understand why they can't do it anymore.
Yeah. And I think I've had the same experience in our investigations. The employee always thinks it's discriminatory and they always want to call it retaliation for whatever. But when you get in there, it's uncertainty on the employee's part of what expectations were, or being given something they saw as a perk of the job, being able to work remote or be flexible, and they've built their life around being able. Maybe they got rid of their babysitter because my 4-year-old is perfectly content, during the day playing, watching TV and doing stuff, and I just have to, make sure they get lunch and play, and do whatever, to make sure they're safe. But now you want me to come in, so becoming your employee just seems more expensive to me than it was before because I've got to arrange daycare again, and you got the problem with as soon as you send the kids to daycare, they come back a week later with the latest flu, the latest cough, or COVID, and so now I can't come into work because I've got to care for this kid, and I continue to see among my employees who have small children, anybody in my office who gets COVID right now, it's almost always because their kids had it first, and it causes a lot of daycare problems. But fortunately, they're all, I say my office, but my office is a bunch of computers now, but they it works because I've got a great team, and we often, to the extent that the kid doesn't need care all day, they can get some work done. And that's one of the advantages. You don't have to drive 30 minutes to work. I got 45 minutes to work here. So I can't drive round trip in a 30-minute commute and get any work done, but I can jump on the computer and knock out 45 minutes. And so I think that's one of the benefits to it. What other policy considerations do you think employers really need to pay attention to as they rethink what their policies are and make sure that that they're creating an engaged culture, but also not digging a hole for themselves later?
Right, right. So again, we talked about job descriptions. So I definitely would make sure that it's very clear what the job description is, so that, because even if a job has been modified a little bit to work remotely, see, that's part of what's happened is some jobs were modified, like some things didn't get done while working remotely, or maybe even remote work might be an accommodation for some kind of ADA or some FMLA or something like that. And so clear job descriptions will help the employer be able to clearly show what the essential functions are, and show that this is not about whether we like you or don't like you. This is what the job needs, and you can or cannot do this anymore. So that's one thing I want to make sure they're very clear on. But other policies, it's going to be, the employer wants to make sure that if they're going to do a hybrid, for example, what are the specific days and times that the employees need to be there, make sure that that's clearly communicated, make sure know how to track the time, make sure if it's a job that, let's say it's a support position, that the employee is accessible during that time, not that every time you call you get a voicemail and then they return your call 3 hours later. That might not be
From
uh,
their car coming back from Starbucks at 2 in the afternoon,
exactly,
right? Yeah.
exactly. Do you need to talk about daycare, or if you're a caregiver, like let the employee know whether you're expected to be fully focused on your job during this period, or if you can have flexibility. So you might need to indicate whether you still need alternate daycare options. Let's see, what else did I have here? Do you have a safe work environment? So, I mean, I know that's the employee's responsibility, but if there is some kind of issue that comes up, could that potentially become a workers' comp claim? So, part of the policy I think that the employer would want to have in place is that the employee is responsible for ensuring that they have a safe work environment, that they have the proper equipment. Some employers provide the equipment to the employee to make sure it's the proper equipment. What about internet use? Does the employer pay a stipend to ensure that the employee has the level of internet that they need, or is that going to be just up to the employee? So that equipment, the equipment, the safe environment, maybe policies about confidentiality and security of the company information. If you're working at home, do you work in a place that others are not going to have access to company information? So the employee should still be responsible for that security and confidentiality. Um, so let me see. The other thing I would say is whatever the rules are, so before putting these policies in place, think about uh, what's important to the organization. And whatever is decided, there should be some kind of an acknowledgement or agreement that the employee signs that says something like, I understand that these are the rules regarding working remotely. I'm responsible for this equipment. If the company provides equipment, I'm responsible for returning it in good shape. In Texas, you can't just deduct from somebody's final paycheck. So maybe even a part of that could be, I understand, some kind of authorization to deduct. So as you issue equipment to your employees, you might have them sign an acknowledgement that they received it. So those are the kinds of things that you might put into place. That way, if a question comes up, it's very clear what the expectations are.
So we're almost out of time, but one last question. If I'm an employer and I feel like I had a good company culture pre-pandemic, um, but I'm concerned that if we stay remote as we bring on new employees, they're not going to integrate the same. They're not going to have the relationships. But I get the feeling from my workforce that unless I want to replace a bunch of people, we better stay remote. What have you seen work, or what have you seen employers doing, or would you recommend as ways to maintain kind of a company culture and employee engagement with each other and that connection in a hybrid or remote environment?
The biggest thing that I can say, I'm going to use the big C word, and communication, right? So anytime I see that there's an issue, or anytime I see that things are going well, and it has to either do with really good, clear communication or lack of communication. So I would say, if there's a way for the top management to continue to not just send emails, but find a way for people to still kind of get together, um, maybe clearly communicate their successes, um, possibly still require people to come in maybe once a month or something like that to kind of get that team vibe. As good as Zoom does in still having the voice and the face, it's still not the same as just having a regular conversation. So I would say just keeping in touch with people. Don't let people fall off. It's really easy when you don't see somebody to let them kind of fall off, or they feel like they fall off and nobody really cares anymore. So just to stay engaged in finding ways to continue to communicate more than just emails.
That's great. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining me, Mary Ann.
Well, thanks, Mike. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you for listening. You can find previous episodes, show notes, and contact info for our guest at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.